Hello, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor a church in Indianapolis, Indiana called Northwood Christian Church, hence the name of our podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about us, write in would be the best way to me directly at my email, which is Heath, my name, Heath, at indynCC.org, INDYNCC.org. You write into me. I'd love to start a correspondence, answer any questions you may have. Or if you'd rather keep your distance, at least check out our website. It needs an update, and we're working on that in the big picture, but it does have some good information about us, our values, and our various goings-on, so there's a place where you might learn more about us. Speaking of the church, I'm talking in the church. I'm recording this on location there during a school day, and so I'm going to give my usual disclaimer about the kids playing outside, raising a ruckus. You'll likely be hearing noises in the background, children shouting, basketballs bouncing. I can hear them now, so apologies up front for that. Hopefully that won't be too much of a distraction. That being said, moving on, I'd like to thank our producer at the All Indiana Podcast Network. I'd encourage you to check out more of the podcasts that they offer. Podcasts recorded here in Indiana by Hoosiers about topics of interest to us, generally speaking, although I think they run the gambit, and if maybe you're out of state, I think also you would enjoy them as well. You can find them by visiting wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. Here in a moment, we're going to read a parable of Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 through 32. But first, I think it'd be good to remind us where we are in the narrative of this gospel. We've been reading from Matthew's gospel for a couple months now, really. And if you recall how last week we considered a different parable, but one that was also, like this one, placed in a vineyard. And the point from last week's was this: everyone in the vineyard is accepted. In other words, the realm of God is where everyone finds a place and is reconciled. And if last week's message was about who is accepted in the vineyard, this week's is about what it is like to live well in that place. What it is like to enjoy life in the realm of God, and what does it look like for us to live up to God's values there? So let's get to the message. But first, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. So first ads, and then we'll see you on the other side. And we're back, which means it's time to read the parable that we're considering in this episode. And I'll just read it now. As I said earlier, it's found in Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 through 32. And it begins with a question. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." He answered, "I will not." But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same, and he answered, "I go, sir." But he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." I just read that parable by itself. I should perhaps give a little bit of context. This parable comes directly after a confrontation that Jesus is having. It's in the middle, really, of a confrontation Jesus is having with the religious authorities of his day. And we have to keep in mind, before we move on, though, that Matthew's portrayal of religious authorities in this gospel is quite likely a caricature and not an accurate portrayal of Jewish religious life, broadly speaking, which is to say the characters we meet in here as Jesus's antagonists are not representative of their faith in that time and place, but are rather more like the religious persons in our own day who will fit that caricature. And we're not all like that, but you know the type that are being described here. Even today, back then too, any number of self-proclaimed gatekeepers of the divine world who seem to answer yes to God, maintaining an appearance of piety, but their behavior seems to say no. to God's purposes and work in the world. And as I was reflecting on these things, I thought of something else that was said to me in my youth that this passage reminded me of for reasons we'll get to in a little bit. And I don't remember who said it or how many times it was said to me, but I remember being asked at some point, son, do you have a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ? And the words I want to highlight here are saving knowledge. Let's think about the implications of those words. Sometimes I heard these words used in a testimony. Someone would stand up and say something like, I used to be a sinner, but then one night the Lord spoke to me and I came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Don't know if you've heard it before. Saving knowledge. If you haven't heard the phrase before, many people's operating theology basically functions that way, as if to say, when you've learned the right things about God intellectually in your head, then you're in. And to me, it felt then and now formulaic. Cross these T's, dot these I's, pray in the name of Jesus, and with the right words, and you're in. But it doesn't stop there. Once you're adequately saved and safe within your saving knowledge of God, then you're to dive deeper. You're to delve into the theological weeds and go to Bible studies and try to help separate the wheat from the chaff. And here I'm not talking about separating saints and sinners, but rather parsing out the wrong and correct ideas about God. If you've ever been a part of a religious community that seemed to be actively engaged in that enterprise, I can remember the theological debates that happened in my faith community about who was really a Christian and who wasn't, about which perspective was the right one. Dead serious. Were the Baptists right to assert that one can't lose your salvation? Or were we right in believing that one can backslide and fall from God's grace? And, we could all find scriptures to back our positions. Both we and the Baptists. I bring all this up, not to litigate old argument or stir a fire in you, but to note just how all-consuming these questions can become in Christian communities, in religious communities, questions about God, questions that always hang in the air. And these questions, growing up, had answers, but no one could agree on those answers. So these questions divided us. Whole movements in the past have sprung out of these divisions. But sometimes you might find yourself a part of a community that has finally discovered the right answers. Well, if that describes your community, buckle up. Now that you've arrived at a saving knowledge of God, you're on the right side of God's cosmic battle. Have you ever been a part of a community that saw themselves as that way, on the right side of God's cosmic battle, war still raging, and so now we defend the faith against basically everyone else almost. We defend the doctrines. We separate ourselves from who seem to hold the same beliefs but differ on some of the details, believing the whole while maybe not getting the details correctly. God right on paper. And we got them right on paper, so we cling to these beliefs. But we'll be safe if we keep the evils outside. Back to the parable. If you think I've been running away with all this, where am I going? Well, in the parable that Jesus tells, the one we read today, comes in the wake of an encounter with religious professionals that basically fit what I'm describing here. Those who know all about God on paper. And those questioning Jesus that day knew all the right answers. They checked off all the boxes, so far as they could tell. And so if salvation comes down to knowledge about God, saving knowledge, then these people might just be the most saved people on the planet. They are like the son in today's parable that says yes to the call with enthusiasm, loudly for all to hear, except Jesus sees through us and then tries to find ways of telling us the truth. Sometimes through parables, sometimes through angry words, and one time through blunt force, just before he told this parable. In one of the stories told, just building up to this parable. You may know the story, actually. It's the one where he threw the money changers out of the temple. Jesus, meek and mild, threw over tables in anger because vendors had turned a place of worship into a place of commerce. That has just happened before Jesus tells this parable. They had turned it into a place of commerce, but not just a place of commerce. The people there sought to line their pockets by selling animals meant to be sacrificed in the temple. The entire enterprise served as an obstacle to the poor who could scarce afford to pay for a proper sacrifice. So moneyed interests here placed before the needs of the people. And this made Jesus angry. So he flipped the tables. Again, you've probably heard that story. If not, read about it in Matthew chapter 20, again, just before the passage we're considering today, or just shortly before. But then what does he do? After he flips over the tables, dust settles, what next? Well, verse 14 of that same chapter reads, "The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them." So the sequence goes. Jesus throws out the money changers and vendors, then he heals, and then in so doing, he's restored the house of God to a place of worship, a place where there are fewer obstacles to the poor, or everyone else for that matter, just open doors to the divine. And then after he's had this encounter, what does he do? After Jesus confronts the temple authorities, he showed them what true care and compassion for the poor looks like by personally ministering to their needs. Those who felt threatened by Jesus' influence over the people then began to question his authority. So the immediate build-up to the parable that I just read is found in verses 21 through 27. You go ahead and read them for yourself, but I'll just kind of paraphrase what they're about. I didn't read them today so we can keep our focus more narrow. But basically, they ask the people that Jesus' opposition, where did all this power come from? From you, God? Who authorized you to do this? Basically is their question. And Jesus doesn't give a straight answer except to say that he got his power and authority from the same place John the Baptist got his. And then he leaves it open-ended. Seems to be saying nothing, but is in fact saying quite a lot. Jesus is saying that his power comes straight from God, as did John's. Now remember too, before we move on, this power that we're talking about here is a power that heals. This is an important point to establish before we move on. Jesus did not wield power for power's sake. As an example, consider the confrontation at the temple one more time. The temple authorities used their power and influence to exploit the poor and then to shore up power and influence for themselves. But Jesus uses his power to purge the temple of what keeps the poor and the vulnerable away. And then he heals them. In short, those that most needed the life the temple was supposed to provide, Jesus made that place a place that would provide that life, and then he supplied some of that himself. So remember that as we process this parable together. Again, this parable is, I think, a response to much of what has just transpired. So remember that. Jesus calls us to a healing ministry, healing of hearts, minds, body, soul, every part of us. So the sequence then goes. Jesus clears the temple, as I keep going on about. Then there's this story about him cursing a fig tree. I haven't talked about that yet. We don't have time for that today. Then he answers questions about his authority. Now the parable that we read earlier. This parable, as I said a second ago, I believe relates to the prior events, the goings on at the temple and Jesus' rowdy behavior there. And in a way, I think that this parable may be Jesus' answer to that encounter. The parable Jesus tells is short and simple, and it's to the point. I could almost read it again and stay within a reasonable time, but I'll just summarize it again. There's one parent, there's two sons. The parent sends both of them out into the vineyard to work. Goes to the first, go out and work, son. Says, no, sir. But then for reasons that we aren't given, it's sort of a mystery, really. That son goes and does the work in the vineyard. And then the other says, when asked, I'll go, sir. This is a clear and resounding, emphatic yes. But then that one, the one who says he'll go, doesn't show up to do the work in the vineyard. And then Jesus asks those religious authorities who were questioning him, who they thought did the will of the Father. And of course, they could only answer one way. Jesus really sort of set them up. Forced their hand, because the answer is that obvious. And so somebody answers the first one, the one who said no, but whose actions said yes. And then Jesus said, and I'll just reread these next two verses as they are so pivotal. in response to them answering that question, the one who does the will of the Father in the vineyard. Truly, I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him. So here, Jesus names two professions that were both derided, even loathed, and for different reasons. Tax collectors worked with the Roman government to collect taxes to pay for the very projects and armies that oppressed the people. Pay for the temples that went up while the people starved. Paid for the armies that maintained order and control, and even sometimes razed villages and towns and plundered. And what's worse, the system was easy to exploit from the tax collector's perspective because the tax collector was expected to raise their own salary, and the tax collectors would all too often lie about how much money was needed by the Roman government and then pocket the difference. You see how this would go. So the tax collectors here would be getting rich in this way by robbing their communities. These aren't Romans coming in and exploiting. These are people from the community partnering with the Romans in collusion to exploit. And for this reason, they were hated. Then prostitutes, do I need to spell it out? This has been true, that prostitutes have been hated and feared, and many times in places. The most consistent business for the prostitutes we're talking about here would have come from the Roman soldiers garrisoned throughout the land. So the kind of person Jesus is talking about here is viewed as filthy dirty for various reasons. Their profession, who their clientele are, the oppressors themselves. So Jesus is describing a very compromised person, to say the least. She or he represent the morally and spiritually damaged of the population. Like the ones who you just by default assume are that broken. At least in the minds of Jesus' opposition, perhaps in the minds of you and me. And then Jesus goes to say in this parable, that, or by way of this parable, making the point that these are the sorts of people who enter into the realm of God first, who seem to get it first, the wicked and the wounded. Perhaps those who are most broken by this world understand all the more our need for God's grace and occasionally a cold drink of water. Maybe they know how precious love and human connection is because they have so often experienced its lack. Maybe they're less apt to judge as they've been judged so often before. They may not have a saving knowledge. In other words, they may not have God figured out on paper, but they have love for their fellow humans. And in this way, many are Christ-like, even as they reject Christ's supposed ambassadors and the words they say. Perhaps the poor and vulnerable are sooner to love one another with the love of Christ and understand the way the realm of God works better and earlier and sooner because it's all they have, this love. At least, maybe they've learned that love may sustain them when little else can. And in Jesus' day, the religious authorities who ran this temple should have been leading the way in engaging these people. This idea that they were called by God to care for the poor and the vulnerable among them was baked into their traditions and written in their scriptures. So they're without excuses, Jesus would often remind them. These things would have been discussed and read in the temple and in synagogues on the regular. To give you an example of the sort of thing that would have been in the air, the sort of messaging that may have hung in the air as people were exploited just at the gates. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 7 and 8 read, "If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand willingly, lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be." That's from the Torah, that passage, and others like it, and there are others like it, would have been read and known by Jesus' opposition in this story, the ones who would be hearing this parable. They would have been like that first son, or the second son, who said yes, and had read and had known and had answered and had been very public in their professions of faith. Yes to the passages like the one I just read and others like it. And in answering their call to minister in the temple, they were implying that the words that we just read would be written on their hearts and revealed by their actions, that they would do this work in the vineyard of life. But just like the second son in this parable, while they loudly and publicly declared their answer to the call, their actions were different. The religious authorities who served there could be thought of as the loudest and most public of yes-sayers. But in the vineyard of life, they did not do the work. Instead, they presided over an operation that exploited the poor and the vulnerable instead of elevating them, which is why Jesus had to clear the temple. They were meant to be an answer to the suffering around them. Instead, they compounded it. I'm sorry to say, it's kind of what we religious folk are known for, even more recently. We say yes to God in public and noticeable ways. We wear it on t-shirts, bumper stickers, go to church, make a witness, but all too often fail to be about the work that really matters to God. So the question for us is, what tables need turned over in our churches and in our time? And I can think of many. And if I listed them all, we'd be here too long, but I can think of a few here. For instance, in the United States, you may remember how churches were segregated not too long ago and how many white Christians openly opposed the civil rights movement. Now notice I did not say in the southern states, because I've since learned that, well, it's true that things were uniquely bad there for black and brown Americans, for reasons I shouldn't have to flesh out. I have since learned that things weren't much better in other places, say in Indiana, where I live, because in the early 20th century, Indiana used to be known as a hotbed for Ku Klux Klan activity and was the home of its leader, the Grand Dragon. It's a dumb name, by the way. And I have since learned that these problems are still with us. Racism in churches, racism in public spaces. So let's flip over this table in our lifetime. Let's not only say yes to the work in the vineyard, but then follow through. We have the head knowledge. We know what we ought to do. Our faith calls for it. We just need to live into our yes. There's one thing. Another thing I'll mention, fear of the LGBTQ plus community, which is amping up. After so much progress, it seems as though the rights of many queer friends and loved ones are again under assault. Lies are told about them so that they will be feared and hated. Pedophiles, they are called. Child groomers. All lies. At least they are no more prone to these temptations than the rest of the population. So just stoking up fear. And where has the church been? Not absent, but actively working against them. It's like we went into the vineyard and instead of helping cultivate life, we began to pull out the vines, calling them perverts and sinners, and often throwing fuel on the hate-filled fire, stoking fear of them in our communities, in our churches, casting them out or demanding that they be something or someone they are incapable of being, straight like so many of us. I believe that the church is missing a moment when we could still be radical in showing love and acceptance for a portion of the population that is vulnerable to persecution, attack, and sometimes worse. So will we hear the call into this vineyard of life and do the work? In Jesus' day, the social pariahs were the blind and the lame, the people who were ethnically different too. And we no longer struggle so much to include these kinds of people into God's family, at least conceptually. We may not live into that very well in practice, but at least conceptually. But now there are others who the church has struggled to include. And here I've been talking about queer folk. I think that perhaps that those are the ones we have struggled the most to include recently. Homophobia in churches, increasing in public spaces. So let's flip over this table. In our lifetime, we have the head knowledge. Our faith calls for it. We just need to live into our yes and love in the vineyard of life. There's two things. What else? There could be many things I could name. Women have been silenced in churches. It's like they've been called to the vineyard and then their mouths taped shut. and they're still silenced in many places. Greed, still rampant. Some churches are primarily money-making enterprises. It's like thought they were called to go to the vineyard and then steal what's there and run off with it. The money changers Jesus threw out of the temple seem like amateurs by the comparison to some of the prosperity gospel preachers that we've got these days. And to name one gigantic problem, again, I said I could just talk about the tables that we could flip over in the name of love. But the poor are still among us. And Jesus said that the poor would always be among us, but he didn't mean that we should resign ourselves to that. Taken into context, Jesus meant that the poor would only be among us always because we never follow through with what we've agreed to do as followers of God in the vineyard. We said yes to the call, and as we were saying yes, it's almost as if we stopped doing the work of Jesus. But if we did the work of Jesus, and Jesus knows this, the poor would be cared for. If what I read earlier from Deuteronomy 15 happened, the poor would be cared for because there are enough resources on this planet Earth to do this. And Christians should lead the way, not only in churches, but how we show up in other places. And in so doing, we would join the work, finally, of Jesus in the vineyard. We would be saying yes and then doing it. But alas, many have not found grace or relief in our churches. Instead, many have found judgment and condemnation. And here we are, the church, filled with people who know all about God, saving knowledge. We talk all about God. We sing about God. Pastors preach sermons, a whole lot of hot air. Even maybe what I'm doing now. Doesn't matter really if we do not love. We possess a lot of head knowledge about God. But as it turns out, what matters is not what you know. You can't think your way into God's realm or get God right on paper ultimately. Ascribing to the right beliefs won't lead you there. At least not that alone. The true way is love. And our love is revealed by our actions, by what we do in the vineyard. Meanwhile, those who are supposed to know the very most about God, priests, preachers, clergy, people like me, who are supposed to share God's love with the communities that surround us on a professional level, well, we've done a very poor job cultivating life in the vineyards, I think. There have been moments in history where the church shined, but we are not always known for our good work. We are often known for the harm we cause. I can't apologize for the harm everyone else has caused, but I can apologize for the part I've played in all of this. And I do, from the bottom of my heart. But here's the good news. We already know all that we need to know. It's not just what you know, but we know enough. We've the Hebrew prophets and the teachings of Jesus to show us the way. Some of that we consider today. And Jesus answered the call and went into the vineyard and then calls us into that place. And so those who are ready to hear will hear it. Do you hear it? Those whose hearts are open will accept Jesus' invitation to join him in this work. Are our hearts open? As I was saying, we know all that we need to know. And even those who don't know much can still love and minister to others. Again, it's not what you know. It's how you love. But whoever you are, the door is open. I love the back end of this parable where we read how the one who says yes and then doesn't go in initially into the vineyard to do the job, well, eventually that one does, or at least that's implied in the language. It said that the prostitutes and the sinners will go ahead of you. You meaning people like me and the religious sort, the ones I've been talking about who sometimes live hypocritically and don't live into the high calling, the big words that we talk about in church. Well, there is hope for us to still join in the work. That's the altar call here. That is the response. That is the holy, profound moment. You and I, even if we've put off work in the vineyard in ways up until now, can still answer yes to the call and then show up, loving recklessly and blessing abundantly. And this is what matters most. Not what we know about God or what we say about God in church, but rather the love of God that we share in the vineyards of life. So let's enter in and join with Jesus in this life-saving work together.